The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and wilting flowers. Room 1-4B of Karachi's shock economy children's ward was not a large room, just one window, one bed, one small wooden chair, and a little girl named Zara, 7 years old, weighing only 19 kilograms. And according to the doctors who had whispered in the hallway just that morning, she had perhaps 3 days left. Sister Fatima, the head nurse who had worked in pediatric oncology for 22 years and had long ago learned not to cry in front of the children, walked into Zara's room that morning to find the girl sitting cross-legged on her hospital bed, not crying, not sleeping, not asking for her mother, but drawing, with a concentration so fierce it looked like prayer. She had to step back into the hallway and press her hand against her chest, because Zara wasn't drawing a flower or a house or a butterfly or any of the things that 7-year-olds usually draw. She was drawing a man's face, a face she had never met, a face she had only seen once, on a torn newspaper clipping she kept folded inside her pillowcase. When Sister Fatima asked her softly who it was, the little girl looked up, her eyes dark and enormous and far too old for her face, and met the nurse's gaze without flinching. That, she said quietly, is the man who needs to know the truth. She folded the drawing carefully, pressed it flat with both palms, and then said something that Sister Fatima would repeat for the rest of her life. Please make sure he gets this. Even if I'm not here to see his face when he opens it. Zara Imran had not had an easy life, but she would have been the last person to tell you that. She had been born in a 2-room apartment in Liari, the oldest and most crowded neighborhood in Karachi, to a woman named Sana Imran, a seamstress who worked 12 hours a day stitching wedding clothes for other people's happiness, while wearing the same 3 outfits herself, rotating them carefully so the neighbors wouldn't notice. Zara's father had never been part of the picture, or at least that was what her mother always said. He left before you were born, Jan. Some people aren't meant to stay. She said it without bitterness, always, with a kind of tired acceptance that young Zara had absorbed and made her own. They were poor, not the cinematic kind of poor that looks beautiful in photographs, but the real kind, where the electricity gets cut off in July, the hottest month, and you sit in the dark sweating and pretending it's an adventure, where school fees are 2 months overdue and you practice your math in the margins of old newspapers, because notebooks cost money you don't have. But Zara was extraordinary in the way that certain children are, the ones who seem to arrive in the world already carrying something luminous inside them. Her teachers at the government school on Hassan Ali Street whispered about her, the way teachers whisper about students who make them feel like their job still matters. She had memorized the entire Surah Yasin before she was 6, could multiply 3-digit numbers in her head faster than the older students with calculators, and drew constantly, on scraps of paper, on the backs of receipts, on the dusty windowsill with her finger when nothing else was available. And she was kind, devastatingly, almost painfully kind. The kind that makes adults ashamed of themselves when the diagnosis came, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Stage 3. Zara had asked only one question. Not will I die? Not will it hurt? She had asked, will Mama be okay? Sana sold everything she owned within 2 weeks, the sewing machine that was her livelihood, her mother's gold earrings, the small television, the electric fan, everything, and it bought them for months of treatment at the government hospital, where the wards were overcrowded and the medicine was inconsistent. And slowly, despite everything Sana sacrificed, Zara got worse. By the time they were transferred to shock economy through a charity referral, that had taken 3 months of paperwork. Zara's body was fighting a battle it was beginning to lose, but her mind was still burning bright, and she had a plan out in the drawer beside her hospital bed. She kept 3 things: a small crayon, a photograph of her mother sleeping that had been taken on Santa's phone before the phone was sold, and printed at a shop for 10 rupees, now slightly crumpled, and a torn piece of newspaper. The clipping was from an issue of Dawn that was almost 2 years old, left on a bench outside the hospital by someone who would never know what they had set in motion. Zara had picked it up because she liked reading, had read every word, and then had seen the photograph on page 6, a man at a press conference, a man with eyes exactly like hers. She had stared at that photograph for a very long time. Then she had folded the clipping, placed it in her pillowcase, and begun to draw. Cyrus Malik was not a villain. That is important to understand. He was 44 years old, the founder and CEO of Malik Tech Solutions. one of Pakistan's largest and most successful technology companies with offices in Karachi, Lahore, Dubai, and London. He had been featured on the cover of Forbes Pakistan twice, had given a TED Talk in Singapore that had been viewed 11 million times, and had donated substantial sums to education initiatives, flood relief, and cancer research foundations, the last one particularly notable, the irony of which would only become apparent later. He drove a white Land Cruiser, wore tailored shower kameez to Pakistani business meetings and a Patek Philippe watch to international ones, and kept a penthouse apartment on Clifton's waterfront alongside a house in DHA he barely visited. And beneath all of it, he was deeply, chronically, quietly unhappy, not the kind of unhappy that shows, but the kind that hides inside a full schedule of back-to-back meetings, international calls, product launches, charity galas, and shareholder presentations, the kind that looks, from the outside, exactly like success. He had been married once, briefly, and it had ended not with screaming or betrayal, but with a quiet mutual agreement that they had both married ideas of each other rather than the actual people. There were no children. His ex-wife had remarried and had the daughter she posted about on Instagram, and he followed the account from a secondary profile he never told anyone about. He told himself he didn't want children, and he told himself this often enough that some days he almost believed it. What he didn't tell anyone, what he hadn't told a single human being in over 7 years, was that there had been a woman before his marriage, a woman he had loved with the reckless, total, terrifying completeness that is only really possible when you are young and don't yet know how to protect yourself from your own feelings. Her name had been Sana. They had met when he was 23, still building his first startup from a rented room in Gulshan Iqbal. She was 21, bright and warm and real in a way that nobody in his growing business circles ever seemed to be, and he had loved her completely for almost 2 years. Then his company began to grow, and his family, old money, connected, with expectations heavy as architecture, made it very clear that Sana was not suitable. A seamstress's daughter from Liari, no family name, no connections. And so Cyrus Malik, at 25, made the worst decision of his life and chose his future over his heart, ending the relationship in a way he was still ashamed of, not with cruelty, but with cowardice. A phone call, short and final. "I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry. I truly am." He had not known she was pregnant. He had told himself over the years that this was simply true, that he hadn't known, that it wasn't his fault, that she could have told him, and he had repeated it so many times, that it had become a stone in his chest he had simply learned to carry. What he had never permitted himself to examine in any of those years was whether part of him had suspected, whether the finality of his departure had been in some unacknowledged chamber of his heart, partly designed to ensure he would never have to find out. He was a brilliant man, a successful man, a generous man in the public ways that count for something. But in this one thing, he had been a coward, and the universe, it turned out, had been keeping very careful records. It was a Thursday when Sister Fatima made the call, having found the number through 3 degrees of connection. A doctor who knew a journalist who had once interviewed Cyrus Malik. It still had APR contacts saved in his phone. It had taken her for days of stubborn, quiet, determined effort, making calls on her lunch break, following threads, refusing to give up, because she had looked at that drawing and seen what Zara had drawn, not just a face, but a face with a specific detail, a small, comma-shaped scar above the left eyebrow, barely visible in the newspaper photograph, but rendered with perfect precision in Zara's pencil lines, a detail a child could not have invented, a detail that meant Zara had studied that photograph with the concentration of someone searching for proof of something she already knew in her bones. Sister Fatima was not a dramatic woman. She was practical, efficient, and unsentimental in the professional ways that keep medical workers functional. But she was also a mother of 3, and when she looked at that drawing and then looked at the sleeping child who had made it, she felt something move in her chest like a slow earthquake. The first 2 attempts went to voicemail. The third reached an assistant named Bilal, who was polite, professional, and clearly trained to manage exactly this kind of situation, emotional stories, requests for the CEO's time, appeals to his humanity. He was sympathetic, took her information, and said he would pass it along. But his voice said plainly that this would go into a folder and stay there. Sister Fatima said, Please tell Mr. Malik that a 7-year-old girl named Zara has made him a drawing. She says it is the most important thing she has ever made. She may not have very long. Please make sure he understands that I am not exaggerating." There was a pause on the line, and then Bilal said he would try. She didn't expect a response. The response came at 6 hours. Cyrus Malik's office called back, and he would visit the following morning. He didn't know why he had agreed, telling himself it was a charity impulse, APR consideration, a slow Thursday, and he didn't examine it more carefully than that. He arrived at the hospital at 9 a.m. in his white Land Cruiser with no cameras, no press, and no assistant. Just himself in a simple gray kurta, carrying nothing. Sister Fatima met him at the entrance and walked with him down the long corridor, telling him the basics in the calm clinical shorthand of someone who has learned to carry devastating information lightly. The child's name, her condition, her prognosis. She did not tell him about the drawing, not yet, because she wanted him to meet Zara first. She wanted him to look at her face and to see whether he saw what she saw. He stepped into room 1-4B to find Zara sitting up in bed in a yellow hospital gown, bald from months of treatment, with small stars drawn on her head in blue marker because, as she had told Sister Fatima, playing was boring. She looked at Cyrus Malik when he walked in, and he, this man who had given TED Talks, who had managed boardrooms and crises and difficult negotiations without flinching, stopped walking. Something happened in his face that he couldn't control and didn't understand, because the child's eyes were looking at him the way eyes look when they recognize something. "Hello," Zara said, her voice small but steady. "I know who you are." Cyrus sat down in the wooden chair beside her bed and asked if she did, and she reached under her pillow and pulled out the newspaper clipping, now soft with handling, and held up the photograph of him at a press conference. 2 years old and slightly blurred. "I found this," she said. Something cold moved through him. "And I made you something," Zara continued, reaching into the drawer beside her bed and bringing out the drawing, carefully folded, pressed flat, kept safe, and holding it out to him with both hands. The way children offer things that matter. He took it, unfolded it, and looked at it for a long time. It was his face, rendered in pencil with a precision and skill that seemed impossible for a 7-year-old's hands. His face, his eyes, and the comma-shaped scar above his left eyebrow that he had gotten when he was 12, falling off his bicycle on a street in Gulshan Iqbal. "Zara," he said, his voice not entirely steady, "how did you draw the scar? The photograph doesn't show it clearly." She looked at him with those enormous dark eyes and said softly, "Because I think I have the same eyes as you. And I thought, if I have your eyes, I probably have other things too." The scar was a guess. She paused. "Was I right?" Cyrus Malik left the room after 20 minutes and stood in the hallway, with his back against the wall, eyes closed, simply breathing. Sister Fatima waited. When he finally turned to her, his face had changed. The polished, composed, controlled surface of the CEO had cracked somewhere, and what was underneath was not weakness, but something rawer and more honest than she had expected. He asked for the mother's name, and when Sister Fatima told him, he closed his eyes again. He asked if she was there, and Sister Fatima told him she was in the waiting room on the ground floor, that she came every day and sat there until visiting hours started. He walked to the elevator without another word and went down. Sana Imran was sitting in a plastic chair near the window, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes distant. She had aged in the way that real hardship ages people, not old, not haggard, but settled into a kind of gravity that hadn't been there before. She was wearing a pale green napada and looking at nothing. She heard footsteps and looked up, and when she saw him, her face did not crumble. She did not gasp or cry or look away. She simply looked at him with an expression that contained everything, the years, the loss, the survival, the cost of it all, and said nothing. Cyrus stood in front of her for a moment that stretched out like a held breath, and then he sat down, not across from her, but in the chair beside her, side by side, both of them facing the same window. "I didn't know," he said. "I need you to know that I genuinely did not know." Sana was quiet for a moment before she answered. She told him she knew, that she hadn't told him, that she had thought it would sound like she was trying to trap him after what he had said on that final call, that she'd had her pride. God help her, she'd had her pride. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and started to ask why she had never reached out, and she told him quietly that by the time she had decided to tell him, He was already on the front page of newspapers. That he had a company, a family name, a whole world she couldn't reach. And then she had Zara, she said, and her voice broke just slightly. Just for a second, Zara had been so much, on her own, enough, more than enough, and she had thought they would be okay. He asked about the drawing, about when Zara had found the newspaper, and Sana told him she hadn't known she'd found it, hadn't known she knew. She turned to look at him for the first time since he'd sat down, her eyes wet, but her face composed, and said that Zara had never told her, that she had made the drawing on her own and made her own plan. A sound came out of her that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. She was 7 years old, Sana said, and she had made a plan. Cyrus said quietly that Zara had wanted him to know the truth, and Sana told him that was exactly it. She had wanted him to know before it was too late, that she hadn't wanted to leave without at least trying. The silence between them settled heavy and thick with the weight of years. He repeated it softly, almost to himself, that she had wanted him to know, even after everything, even without ever having met him. Sana shook her head slowly and said that Zara didn't have anger in her, that she didn't know where the girl had gotten that from because it certainly wasn't from her. She had had plenty of anger, but Zara had simply wanted him to know he had a daughter. She had said it wasn't fair for him to go through life not knowing. She had said it wasn't fair to him. And Cyrus Malik, who had built a company from nothing, who had sat in rooms with government ministers and international investors and never wavered, dropped his face into his hands and wept. 3 days later, Cyrus Malik walked into the most important meeting of his life, and it was not a boardroom, not a press conference, not a shareholder call. It was the hospital's annual fundraising gala, held in the grand hall on the ground floor, with chandeliers and round tables and Karachi's wealthiest and most prominent citizens, in their finest clothes, gathered to raise money for children who would never attend such an event. The irony was not lost on anyone who thought about it carefully. Cyrus had been scheduled to give the keynote address. He was the gala's largest donor. He had given his speech before, polished and moving and appropriately personal, without being actually vulnerable. And he had a draft prepared on his phone. He threw it away before he stood up. He walked to the podium to find the room full. 300 people at least. Faces turned toward him, expecting the familiar speech. Industry colleagues, board members, journalists, hospital administrators, donors. And at the back of the room, sitting in a wheelchair brought down from the pediatric ward at Zara's own insistence, because Sister Fatima had told her about the gala and Zara had said, with absolute calm, "I want to be there, please," was a small girl in a yellow hospital gown with stars drawn on her head. Cyrus saw her when he reached the podium and stopped for just a moment. She gave him a small wave. He gripped the sides of the podium and began to speak. He told the room he had been asked to give a speech about why he supported the hospital, about his philanthropic vision, about his company's commitment to healthcare in Pakistan. And then he paused and said he couldn't give that speech. He was sorry. A murmur moved through the room. He said he needed to tell them something true instead, because there was a little girl in that room who had taught him, in the past 3 days, that the only things worth saying are the true things. And she had taught him that by being braver at 7 years old than he had been at any point in his adult life. The room went very quiet. He told them that 17 years ago he had ended a relationship because he was a coward, that he had been 25 with ambitions and had made a choice, had told himself it was the right choice, had told himself he had no other option, and had told himself this for almost 2 decades. Then 2 weeks ago, he said, exhaling slowly, a hospital ward nurse had called his office to tell him a dying child had made a drawing and wanted to give it to him. He reached into his pocket, unfolded the drawing, and held it up. He told them that this child, who had never met him, who had grown up without knowing him, who had spent the last year fighting the disease with a courage that shamed him, had made this drawing of his face, had kept a newspaper photograph of him in her pillowcase, and had asked the nurse she had known for 3 months to please make sure he received it, even if she wasn't allowed to see his face when he opened it. His voice faltered. He steadied it. Her name was Zara, he said. She was 7 years old. She was his daughter. The silence in the room was absolute. He told them her mother was a woman he had abandoned, a woman who had raised this extraordinary child alone, with nothing, with impossible dignity, a woman who had never asked him for anything, Not money, not acknowledgement, not even an apology. A woman who had let her daughter decide, on her own, whether the truth deserved to be told. He looked out at 300 utterly still faces and said that the truth had deserved to be told, and that Zara had known that before any of them. He looked toward the back of the room, toward the small girl in the wheelchair watching him with those enormous dark eyes, and told the audience that he had spent the last 3 days sitting beside his daughter's hospital bed, listening to her talk about mathematics and stars, and the names she had given to the pigeons on her window ledge, watching her fall asleep, sitting in that chair in the dark, and understanding fully for the first time exactly what he had lost, what he had chosen to lose. His jaw tightened as he said he could not undo it, could not give her back the years she had spent without a father, could not give Sana back the years she had spent struggling alone, that those years were gone and the weight of that was something he would carry for the rest of his life, as he should. But what he could do, what he intended to do, starting that night, was be present, completely, fully, unconditionally present, for whatever time they had. He folded the drawing carefully and placed it back in his pocket. He announced a complete restructuring of the Malik Foundation's focus. From that point forward, its primary mission would be pediatric cancer treatment access for families who could not afford care. Free treatment with no waiting lists, no paperwork barriers, because no child in Pakistan should be denied a fighting chance, because their parent was a seamstress from Liari. He touched his left eyebrow and said that Zara had asked him, the first day he met her, whether she had been right about the scar. She had been right, he said, about everything. The room came alive, not with applause, not immediately, but first with that specific heavy quality of silence. That means 300 people are trying not to cry in public. And then, starting somewhere near the back, near a small girl in a yellow hospital gown who had begun clapping with thin and careful hands, the applause began. Zara did not die in 3 days. The doctors had given her 3 days, but Zara, it turned out, had not agreed with this assessment, and she stayed for 11 more weeks. Whether it was the treatment adjustment that the hospital made possible with Cyrus's immediate and unconditional financial involvement, a newer medication, a specialist flown in from London, better nutritional support, or whether it was something else, something that medicine cannot fully quantify, something that has to do with a child suddenly having a reason to hold on. Nobody could say precisely. Those 11 weeks were not easy. There were bad days, days when she was too tired to draw and too weak to sit up and too sick to eat, days when Sana sat in the chair and held her hand and neither of them spoke. But there were also good days. On the good days, Cyrus came in the mornings. He brought her drawing pencils, professional grade, the kind that artists used, in a wooden case with her name engraved on it, and books about mathematics and astronomy. And he sat in the wooden chair beside her bed where sometimes they talked, and sometimes they simply existed in the same room, which was, Zara informed him once, also a kind of talking. He learned, over those 11 weeks, approximately 1,000 things about his daughter, that she believed pigeons were underestimated, that she could recite the first 20 elements of the periodic table and was working on the next 20, that she had very specific opinions about which nurses had the best method of drawing blood, with Sister Fatima winning obviously, that she preferred silence to music except for certain very specific nasheeds, and that she laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them, and found this so embarrassing that she had developed an elaborate system of coughing to disguise it. He learned her, memorized her, committed her to himself the way you commit a prayer, with full attention, and with the understanding that this is something you must not get wrong. He and Sana found their way to something. That was not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness suggests a debt being wiped, and Sana was too honest a person to pretend the debt wasn't real, but something more useful than forgiveness, a shared love for the same person, a willingness to put that love first, a daily quiet unspoken agreement to be better than they had been. Cyrus did not try to pretend he was owed something by this situation. He did not push and he did not perform. He simply showed up every morning for 11 weeks, and gradually, slowly, the way light comes in winter, almost imperceptibly, Sana began to leave the door open when she arrived, so that he could walk in without knocking. It was a small thing. It was enormous. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, Zara asked Sister Fatima to bring her a large piece of paper, not the small sheet she usually used, but a big piece. She drew for 3 hours with the concentration that had always looked like prayer because Sister Fatima suspected it probably was. When she was done, she asked Sister Fatima to roll it up carefully and put it in a tube, and she gave the tube to Cyrus that afternoon and told him not to open it yet. When he asked when he should open it, she thought about it for a moment and said he should open it when he needed to remember something important, that he would know when. He promised her passed away on a morning in early spring, when the air coming through the window was cool and the pigeons on the ledge were, as Sister Fatima noted, particularly vocal. She was peaceful. She was not alone. What Cyrus opened eventually, on a night 6 months later, when the weight of her absence was particularly heavy, when he sat in his penthouse apartment feeling the specific ache of all the years he hadn't known her, and the shorter, even more piercing ache of the weeks he had, was a drawing of a family, not a perfect family, not an idealized one, but a specific one, a woman with a green dupatta, laughing, a tall man with a comma-shaped scar above his left eyebrow, and a small girl between them, bald, with stars drawn on her head, holding both their hands. Above the drawing, in careful, slightly uneven 7-year-old handwriting, she had written, "This is what I wanted. I think we almost got there. That's enough, Zara." The Zara Imran Foundation was established for months after her passing. Its mission to ensure that no child in Pakistan is denied cancer treatment due to financial circumstances, free diagnosis, free treatment, free family support from intake to recovery. In its first year, it served over 400 children. Sana Imran joined the foundation's advisory board, bringing to it the particular knowledge of someone who had lived the crisis. The foundation existed to prevent, and she and Cyrus built something together, not the life they might have had, not a romance recovered from history, but something real and purposeful and genuine, a partnership around a shared grief that had, improbably, become a shared meaning. At the foundation's first annual event, Cyrus gave a speech that was shorter than his speeches usually were. He said that a little girl with stars on her head had once told him that sitting in the same room as someone is also a kind of talking, and that he had spent 44 years filling rooms with noise, and that she had taught him, in 11 weeks, how to be quiet enough to actually hear something. He paused, and then he said her name was Zara, that she was 7 years old, that she had changed everything, and that she had done it with a pencil and a piece of paper and a kind of courage that most of us spend our whole lives trying to find. He reached into his jacket pocket and touched, without removing it, the folded drawing, the first one, the one she had handed him with both hands. "If you take nothing else from tonight," he said, "take this. The children in your life are watching you more carefully than you know. They are drawing your face from memory. They are deciding what kind of people you are. They are forming conclusions." He let the room sit with that for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "Try to be someone worth drawing.